December 16, 1944, 5:31 a.m. The woods around Moncha, near the German-Belgian border, lay hushed in the chill of pre-dawn. Snow clung to the pines in jagged silence. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the U.S. 46th Artillery Group stood alone, peering through his field glasses. Ahead, a storm was gathering. Through the darkness, movement stirred, columns of German troops amassing with a purpose. A surprise offensive was brewing, and Axelson could feel it in his bones. Behind him, stacked carefully under a camouflage net, were the T-98 ammunition crates, each one containing something the enemy could neither see nor imagine. They were proximity-fused shells, top-secret weapons so advanced they had been banned for land use by direct order of Allied High Command. The brass didn't want to risk a single shell falling into enemy hands. The consequences of such technology being reverse-engineered were unthinkable, but war rarely waits for permission. "Colonel," came the voice of his operations officer, sharp with urgency. "German artillery has started. The 38th is under heavy fire. They're requesting immediate support." Axelson turned to face the crates again. His mind raced, not with doubt, but with grim acceptance. The rules were clear, yet so was the situation. The 38th Cavalry Squadron was about to be overrun. He glanced again at the horizon. The Germans were throwing everything they had. If this was Hitler's final push, he intended to break through the Ardennes before the Allies could respond. He gave the order, low but resolute. "Load the VT shells." There was a pause, just a second, but it stretched with the weight of history. The gun crews hesitated, then obeyed. The term VT was a deliberate code. It stood for variable time, misleading in its simplicity, meant to confuse enemy eavesdroppers. What the acronym masked was something that would change the very nature of ground warfare. Within minutes, the 46th Artillery opened fire. At 6:18 a.m., just 47 minutes after the German offensive began, American guns responded, not with more of the same, but with something the Germans had never experienced. The shells didn't strike the ground. They exploded above it, right where the German soldiers thought they were safe. Thousands of steel fragments rained down at supersonic speed. The foxholes they had dug so carefully turned into death traps. Defensive doctrine, drilled into them since basic training, meant nothing in the face of this new kind of artillery. The air itself had turned against them. That morning would mark the debut of the proximity fuse in land warfare. What had begun as a desperate, unauthorized act became a transformation. In those early minutes of chaos, Colonel Axelson had done more than disobey orders. He had changed the physics of death on the battlefield. And though he didn't know it yet, his decision would reverberate across every front, every strategy, every command briefing until the final German surrender. The countdown had begun. Not just to the end of a battle, but to the beginning of a new era. And for the German troops crawling toward the Allied line that morning, the sky above was no longer silent. It had turned lethal. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that from this day forward, no amount of earth could protect them, not from what was falling from above. Axelson's decision didn't come lightly. Behind every order was a calculation, and behind this one was the memory of too many men lost in trenches, their positions shredded by superior fire or drowned in the mud of indecisive warfare. The colonel had been in the thick of the European campaign for long enough to understand one brutal truth. There were moments when following protocol meant letting good men die. And today he wasn't going to let that happen. By the time the second volley of VT shells landed, the German front units were in disarray. Radio intercepts confirmed what observers saw through binoculars: troops scattering, formation integrity collapsing. One intercepted message repeated a single word: Luftminen, air mines. Panic spread faster than shrapnel. The proximity fuse, a marvel of engineering barely the size of a coffee cup, had done something no commander on the field could have predicted. It had removed the illusion of safety. Soldiers were trained to hit the dirt under shell fire, to trust in their foxholes. But now the explosions bloomed above them, just high enough to bypass any cover and send hot steel straight down. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, and the Germans weren't ready for it. Axelson's gunners knew they were using something extraordinary. But even they didn't understand how extraordinary. Each shell contained a miniature radio, built to survive the 20,000 G-force of launch, spinning up to 30,000 RPM in flight. When the radio signal bounced back from the ground at a preset height, 30 feet, it triggered detonation. The math was exact, the effect horrifying. The 38th Cavalry held, barely, and only because those fuses detonated overhead. By mid-morning, Colonel Axelson had submitted a full after-action report, not just to defend his insubordination, but to prove that the new technology worked. It wasn't theory anymore, it was reality. 3 days later, General Eisenhower lifted the restriction on land use. The fuse was no longer a secret to keep. It was a weapon to unleash. Yet by then the German offensive, what they called Operation Watch on the Rhine, and what the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, was already suffering from the first wave of airburst artillery. Units advancing through the dense forests near Krinkel and Malmedy walked straight into VT saturation fire. The snow turned red. In one after-action report, a US observer wrote, "They stepped over their own dead to continue the assault." But many didn't continue. Some simply surrendered. Others froze, motionless under the trees, unwilling to move forward, unable to retreat. Captured German officers described the confusion. "We thought it was new anti-aircraft fire," one said. "But the shells were aimed at the ground." Another muttered, "The sky is broken." But the sky wasn't broken. It had been engineered, designed, tested, mass-produced. And in that design lay not just tactical advantage, but a shift in the moral architecture of warfare. Because for the first time in modern combat, death didn't need to find you. It already knew where you'd be. All it needed was altitude and timing. As dusk fell on December 16th, Colonel Axelson stood quietly near his command tent, listening to the radio. His men had held, the line was intact, but he knew this was just the beginning. Because once a weapon like the VT fuse entered the field, nothing would ever be the same again. And the men who survived that day would carry its echo forever, etched not in their memories alone, but in the very ground that failed to protect them. The first days of the German offensive had been meant to surprise, overwhelm, and fracture the Allied line. Hitler's gamble was that the fog, the snow, and the silence of winter would conceal his final, desperate thrust westward. But what he hadn't counted on, what no one in Berlin had imagined, was that the Americans had broken not just codes, but the laws of probability. By December 18th, as snow choked the forested hills and roads of the Ardennes, more artillery groups began requesting access to VT-fused shells. Some had only heard rumors. Others had witnessed the results firsthand. Enemy columns halted, trees shredded mid-canopy, foxholes filled with the dead. The word spread quietly but quickly. The new fuse didn't miss. It hunted from the air. At the 4th Infantry Division headquarters near Hürtgen Forest, Lieutenant Walter Davis was poring over maps when the call came in. Requesting immediate saturation of grid L39, "They're pushing through again." He glanced up. "Are we cleared for VT rounds?" His commanding officer nodded slowly. "As of today, use them." That day, American howitzers fired over 12,000 VT-fused shells into the dense German lines. The results were unlike anything they had seen in months of forest warfare. Where once tree bursts were a matter of careful calibration and luck, the new shells found their own height, their own moment. They exploded just above the treetops, ripping branches, sending wooden splinters as deadly as steel into anything below. German soldiers who had trusted the forest to shield them found themselves under a different kind of rain. One sergeant described it as a storm with teeth. Medical stations on both sides reported new wound patterns, deep, narrow punctures from above, clustered on heads, necks, and shoulders. No cover worked, no plan mattered. Even the psychological math changed. Where traditional artillery had been survivable, if terrifying, the new shells brought with them a certainty. You didn't dodge these, you didn't wait them out. You either weren't there when they landed, or you didn't survive. Back at the US command post, reports flooded in. Entire German battalions had gone silent. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed fields littered with enemy equipment, bodies curled into craters, some not even showing signs of trauma, just faces frozen in shock, eyes still wide. And still, the production lines in America ran without pause. In cities like Cincinnati, Ipswich, and Rochester, thousands of women bent over magnifying lenses, soldering parts smaller than a pencil tip. They didn't know exactly what they were building. They didn't need to. The clean rooms they worked in were kept within 2 degrees of tolerance. Errors smaller than a human hair meant rejection. But when those components worked, when they fired, they rewrote the rules of survival on the battlefield. By December 19th, Eisenhower formally requested the lifting of all restrictions. 2 days later, the order came through. Use VT fuses wherever necessary. Every front, every theater. But in that authorization was a hidden truth. This wasn't just about the Germans anymore. It was about momentum, morale, dominance. The Allies weren't just holding back an offensive. They were seizing the future. Colonel Axelson, now hailed as both reckless and visionary, remained quiet through the accolades. He had made a choice in the dark, before the first shell flew, and now as the sun set over the frozen battlefield once again, he understood what had truly changed. The earth, once the soldiers' final sanctuary, had been stripped of its power. The sky had claimed it, and it would never give it back. It wasn't long before the German high command began to sense something was terribly wrong. Reports filtered in from the front lines, unusually high casualties from artillery strikes, entire platoons wiped out in seconds, foxholes no longer providing protection. At first, they dismissed it as exaggeration. Then came the fragments. Scouting units recovered strange metal pieces from shell craters, scored and twisted in patterns that defied normal explosive residue. Their engineers studied them with narrowed eyes. Something was different, something impossible. In October of that year, weeks before the Battle of the Bulge, German Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring had already warned Berlin of rising Luftwaffe losses from Allied anti-aircraft fire. He had noted odd detonation patterns, unusual blast timing, and fragments that suggested mid-air explosions. His recommendation was clear: investigate proximity-triggered weapons. The official response from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht: dismissal. Such battlefield detonation mechanisms are technically unfeasible under current physics, and yet their soldiers were dying under a sky that proved otherwise. By December 23rd, American artillery had fired over 200,000 proximity-fused shells in the Ardennes sector alone. Intelligence estimates placed German casualties from VT rounds near 2,000 in just one pocket of the front. In Malmedy, SS divisions found themselves stalled, not by tanks, but by the rain of invisible death from above. Prisoners taken during this period spoke in haunted tones. Some believed the Americans had summoned a new kind of mine, one that floated in the air. Others, more shaken, said the Americans had machines that could see them from the sky and strike with perfect timing. One German lieutenant, a veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, said flatly, "Our doctrine has failed. Our bunkers are useless." The true genius of the proximity fuse lay in its simplicity of concept and difficulty of execution. A tiny radio signal, bouncing between shell and ground, calculated altitude with exacting precision. Detonation occurred not on impact, but at precisely 30 feet above the surface, high enough to cast fragments outward and downward in a lethal cone, covering a radius nearly 3 times greater than ground bursts. Engineers in Germany had toyed with similar ideas in the 1930s, acoustic fuses, electrostatic sensors, but none made it past the prototype phase. Hitler had ordered that only weapons deployable within 6 months be funded. The result? Projects that required patience and precision were shelved, deemed luxuries in a war of attrition. Now the irony was unbearable. In the cold forests of Belgium, German troops were dying by the tens, then hundreds, to a technology they had once imagined and abandoned. Back in the American rear lines, Colonel Axelson read the latest field reports with a silent solemnity. His artillery officers, some barely older than college kids, now understood the weight of their fire missions. What they launched was no longer just steel and powder. It was science weaponized. It was inevitability given flight. As Christmas approached, the shelling intensified. The sky above the front lines no longer meant sheltering flurries of snow. It was an executioner, silent until it struck, and when it did, it left behind silence of a different kind. For the first time, German command knew they were facing something outside their doctrine, beyond their design. But by the time they realized what it was already too late. Because by the time you heard the VT shell, it had already done its job. And no one, no matter how brave, could dig deep enough to escape what was coming. On December 25, 1944, as most of Europe lay buried under ice and smoke, General George S. Patton stood beside a forward command post near Echternach. Snow clung to his greatcoat. His breath formed short clouds in the frigid air. He had just received the casualty report, 700 confirmed enemy dead in a single engagement, all from artillery strikes using the new fuses. He lowered the paper slowly and turned to his aide. "The funny fuse," he muttered, almost to himself, "won the Battle of the Bulge for us." It was a rare admission from the tank-obsessed general who had once questioned the over-reliance on artillery. But what he had seen that morning shifted his thinking. The American artillery, once considered a support weapon, had now become the decisive blade of the battlefield. It didn't just hold the line, it broke it. The proximity fuse had made that possible, and its impact wasn't only strategic. It was psychological. Interrogations of German prisoners captured that week painted a chilling picture. Soldiers described overwhelming fear, not of the shells themselves, but of their consistency. "Every blast is the same height," one said. "We dig deeper, but it doesn't matter." Another, younger and clearly traumatized, whispered, "The sky knows where we are." German doctrine had always emphasized trench warfare, cover and movement under fire. The proximity fuse flipped that logic on its head. It punished exactly those behaviors. Deep holes became traps. Dispersed formations became the only refuge, but even that had its limits. American forward observers began noticing changes. German infantry no longer huddled in foxholes. Instead, they crawled into abandoned buildings, trenches with overhead logs, or simply scattered in small clusters. But this tactic forced tighter concentration elsewhere, making them easy targets for conventional high-explosive shells. There was no safe solution, only desperate improvisation. Meanwhile, back home, the factories building the VT fuses didn't pause for Christmas. At the Crosley plant in Cincinnati, over 8,000 workers, most of them women, filed into the assembly lines, continuing their delicate, meticulous work. Some attached tiny propeller blades. Others calibrated vacuum tubes, their hands steady under microscopes. Few of them knew exactly what the devices did, but they had been told this. Their work saved American lives, and it did. Every shell assembled meant fewer infantry needed to storm fortified positions. Every airburst over a German trench meant fewer Americans dying under machine gun nests or mortar fire. The equation was cruel, but effective. In the Hurtgen Forest, where weeks earlier the US had suffered devastating casualties, the story began to change. Now, with proximity-fused shells falling into the treetops, the tables turned. The very canopy that had shielded German defenders became a weapon against them. The artillery created storms of steel and splintered wood. Survivors stumbled out with shredded uniforms, torn skin, and hollow eyes. The battlefield had become a laboratory, and the results were clear. By the end of December, the fuse that Colonel Axelson had used in defiance had become the standard. No longer a secret, no longer theoretical. It was deployed across the entire front. But Axelson, though praised in military circles, remained quiet. He visited the batteries often, walked among the men, listened to the silence that followed each barrage. He understood what had changed, and what it cost. War had always been about terrain, about angles, about cover. But now, for the first time in modern combat, it was about altitude, 30 feet. That's all it took to make the difference between life and death. 30 feet, the space between safety and slaughter. And the Americans had mastered it. As January 1945 dawned over the war-torn countryside of Western Europe, the Allies found themselves pushing back against what had once seemed like a catastrophic collapse. The German offensive had been blunted, not by tanks or infantry, but by cold steel falling from the sky at precisely calibrated heights. Operation Grenade, the planned Allied push toward the Rhine River, was now approaching. The ground was frozen solid, the forest still haunted by the ghosts of the December fighting. But the Americans were no longer playing defense. The Ninth Army was preparing to go forward, armed with something no army in history had ever wielded at such scale. In the planning tent, Major David Halperin, a logistics officer from New York, pointed to a map dotted with German fortifications. "These bunkers," he said, "they took them months to build. Overhead log covers, dug 10 feet deep. None of it matters now." He wasn't boasting, he was simply stating what everyone at the table had come to accept. The proximity fuse made traditional defenses obsolete, and the enemy was learning that the hard way. German command, growing increasingly desperate, issued new orders. Foxholes had to be deeper, no less than 8 feet, and reinforced with logs and 2 feet of packed earth. Movement in areas under shell threat was to occur only through covered trenches. Concrete bunkers were to be prioritized, but it was too late, and it was impossible. Field conditions didn't allow for such constructions. There wasn't enough wood, time, or manpower. Artillery came too fast, too precise. Entire German engineering units were assigned to dig, only to find their efforts shattered in the first hour of shelling. For every position they tried to fortify, the Americans had a battery waiting, calibrated, ready. The VT fuse had another, subtler advantage. It let the Americans fire less, but kill more. A single shell did the work of 5. Instead of prolonged barrages to suppress enemies, artillery could now deliver shorter, more lethal volleys and move on. Barrel life increased, ammunition stockpiles lasted longer, supply chains stretched thinner without breaking. It was efficiency born not just of engineering, but of American industrial doctrine. On the production side, the scale was staggering. By January, over 70,000 proximity fuses were being manufactured each day. Quality control was brutal. Up to 28% of units were discarded for failing to meet the near-impossible tolerances. That rejection rate, which would have halted German production entirely, was manageable in the American system. Because the volume was so vast, they could afford to destroy more than their enemies could ever build. One Crosley plant alone used more electricity than some German cities. At Sylvania's factory in Massachusetts, over 9,000 women worked under sterile conditions, assembling vacuum tubes smaller than a matchstick, soldering wires thinner than a hair. They did not wear uniforms. They wore smocks, gloves, and magnifying lenses. Their war was fought in decimals, in precision. Their battlefield was clean and white, and humming with fluorescent light. And every time a shell detonated at exactly 30 feet over a German machine gun nest, their hands were in that explosion. What was once considered science fiction had become standard issue. And in the villages and forests of Western Germany, where Wehrmacht soldiers still clung to fading dreams of victory, the realization was setting in. The Americans had broken the old rules. There was no longer a place to hide. February 23, 1945. The wind sliced across the plains of Western Germany as Operation Grenade roared to life. The Ninth Army surged forward, crossing the Roer River under a blanket of coordinated artillery fire. But this wasn't just any barrage. It was methodical, modern, and terrifyingly precise, guided by science, executed by machines, and delivered by fuses that knew when and where to kill. In the opening week of the offensive, hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells rained down on German positions. American gunners no longer fired blindly or hoped for suppression. They calculated, they calibrated, and when they fired, they shattered. German field reports from that week, later captured and translated, painted a scene of chaos. Units dug into reinforced trenches found themselves buried beneath showers of supersonic fragments. Communications between forward posts disintegrated. Medical stations overflowed. One Wehrmacht commander simply wrote, "Our cover is no longer cover, our shelters are death." Back at headquarters, American analysts confirmed the impact. Artillery observers recorded a sharp decline in enemy counterattacks. Interrogated prisoners described units halting mid-advance, some refusing to leave cover, others breaking ranks entirely. One lieutenant confessed, "We were ordered to charge, we waited." And then the sky exploded. The proximity fuse had turned nature itself into a weapon. Trees, once allies to the hidden and the entrenched, became shrapnel delivery systems. Open fields, once covered in snowdrifts, were scoured bare of life. The very terrain betrayed its defenders. In response, the German High Command issued increasingly desperate construction mandates. Every position had to have overhead protection, logs, concrete, anything. Movement was to be restricted to night. Trenches were to be camouflaged with steel and snow. But the orders were fantasies. The materials didn't exist. The labor didn't exist. The time didn't exist. Meanwhile, American industry continued its relentless pace. Over 100 US companies fed the proximity fuse supply chain. Copper was mined in Montana, silver drawn from federal reserves, plastics developed in labs that hadn't existed 5 years prior. Clean rooms operated around the clock. Engineers revised circuit tolerances daily, improving yield, increasing reliability. Crosley, RCA, Sylvania, Kodak, McQuay, Norris. Their output wasn't just production, it was momentum. And that momentum was now rolling over Germany. In cities like Cologne and Kassel, German artillery crews, once feared for their precision, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Shells from American guns exploded overhead before they could even return fire. And those who survived the first barrage often couldn't survive the second. The story repeated across the front, in Weissweiler, in Jülich, in the Rhineland. The math of warfare had changed. But the American soldiers on the ground didn't speak in terms of vectors and fragmentation cones. They talked about how quickly the shelling ended a firefight, about how their buddies made it through towns that would have been meat grinders months ago, about how, for the first time, they believed they might actually make it home. Proximity fuses didn't just protect them, they changed the way they fought. Faster advances, shorter engagements, fewer casualties. And while the enemy dug deeper and covered harder, the truth became impossible to ignore. There was no longer a front line the Germans could hold, not when the air itself was against them. March 7, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, one of the last intact crossings over the Rhine River, and a gateway into the heart of Germany. American infantry had reached it by chance. What followed would become one of the most symbolic moments of the final European push. As German demolition crews scrambled and panicked, Lieutenant Karl Timman, holding a battered field radio, called in artillery support. His voice crackled over the signal. "We need proximity rounds. Enemy forces are retreating across the bridge. We can cut them off." But the reply from artillery command was immediate and final: denied. American forces were too close. The VT fuse was too lethal, too indiscriminate. In this moment, the very strength of the proximity shell became a liability. It was a precision weapon in design, but not in targeting. If it exploded overhead, it didn't care who stood below. Timman understood. He didn't argue, but as he watched German soldiers sprint across the steel span, he knew what could have been, and he knew that even the most advanced technology had limits. The proximity fuse was not a sniper's bullet, it was a scalpel of shrapnel, a surgical strike in airburst form. But its rules were fixed. 30 feet meant 30 feet, friend or foe. In the weeks that followed, American artillery adapted. They learned how to shift fire lines, adjust spacing, create zones of safety. But the bridge at Remagen became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most revolutionary weapon must be wielded with care. Back in Berlin, German command grew frantic. Their intelligence teams had finally begun piecing together what was happening. Reports recovered after the war showed frantic attempts to identify the technology. Altitude-triggered fusing suspected. Fragmentation patterns indicate airburst detonation. Recommend countermeasure development. But no countermeasures came, not because they didn't try, but because the technology wasn't just advanced, it was years ahead. German engineers, brilliant as they were, couldn't bridge the gap. They lacked the materials, the infrastructure, the time. By early 1945, German shell production had devolved into desperation. Quality control dropped below 60%. Sabotage from forced labor inside munitions plants further degraded reliability. In some sectors, 1 in 3 shells failed to detonate. Meanwhile, American shells, each one packed with a miniature radio station, each one hardened to survive launch forces that would liquefy human tissue, boasted over 94% reliability. And they were fired by the millions. Colonel Axelson, now operating farther east with the 46th Artillery Group, had grown used to seeing the effects. But he never grew numb. Each crater, each silent battlefield, reminded him of the cost. Not just to the enemy, but to history. He read reports from captured officers who admitted they no longer trusted their training. The old rules of cover, of terrain, of timing, all had failed. One even said, "It was like fighting a ghost. We could hear the shells but never see where they would fall. and when they did, nothing survived. As March wore on, the Rhine crossings increased. The German army, once so sure of its tactical doctrine, now moved in fragments. Battalions operated in pairs or trios. Orders changed daily. Commanders rotated out in weeks. The Wehrmacht wasn't just losing a war. It was unraveling, and every shell that burst at 30 feet pulled another thread loose. Victory wasn't just a matter of firepower anymore, it was about time, and America had already moved ahead. By late March 1945, events in Europe were entering their final stages. As Allied forces progressed, the strategic situation evolved. One of the last major engagements involving the large-scale use of proximity fuse technology occurred during the final movements into the Ruhr industrial region. A significant number of German troops were positioned in this area, which had once been a major center of production. American units demonstrated a high level of coordination in their artillery operations, a capability that had advanced considerably over the previous year. Dozens of batteries fired proximity-fused shells in synchronized waves, creating airbursts so dense that observers said the sky looked like it was on fire. The Germans tried to disperse, they tried to dig, but every tactic failed. Every trick they had once relied upon was nullified. One American forward observer later wrote in his report, "They didn't run, they didn't even scatter. They just froze. I think they knew. No hole was deep enough." Captured German officers begged for explanations. They asked if the Americans had invented some new radar, some supernatural guidance. Some suspected magnetic fields. One senior officer, a veteran of Stalingrad, said quietly, "This is not war, this is extermination." But it wasn't extermination, it was efficiency. It was engineering. It was a consequence of connecting science to manufacturing, and manufacturing to doctrine. Germany had tried to develop its own proximity fuse. Tests had been conducted as early as 1943. But without the raw materials, the clean rooms, or the specialized workforce, they couldn't even begin to scale. The few prototypes they managed to fire were fragile, inconsistent, and often destroyed in the barrel. To build what the Americans had built, Germany would have needed 50,000 trained workers, 15 new factories, and tons of copper and silver, resources they no longer controlled. The irony ran deep. German scientists had understood the theory before the Americans, but they hadn't believed it was possible to mass produce. And even if they had, Hitler's demand that all weapons be operational within 6 months killed innovation before it could breathe. While Germany bet on miracle weapons like the V-2 rocket, America bet on refinement. While the V-2 shattered buildings, the proximity fuse shattered infantry formations. While the rocket consumed billions and achieved headlines, the fuse, cheaper, quieter, won battlefields. By the end of March, German command issued a final set of directives. Foxholes must now be dug 10 feet deep. Overhead protection must include reinforced concrete. Movement should occur only under full darkness. But these were fantasies. The average German rifleman had no concrete, no time, no tools. In American positions, the artillery crews reloaded and re-aimed. More VT shells arrived by the truckload, their fins gleaming in the morning frost. And from high above, Allied reconnaissance reported the same pattern again and again. German units huddled in craters, too afraid to move. Roads once crowded with convoys were now empty. No columns advanced. The Wehrmacht was no longer retreating. It was simply ceasing to move. For the first time, it seemed, the German army had lost its will, not just to fight, but to survive. Not because of morale, not because of politics, but because the air itself had turned against them. And there was no defense against that. April 1945. The collapse was everywhere. German cities lay in ruin. Railways twisted like broken spines. Communications fell silent. From the Baltic to Bavaria, Allied forces advanced through a nation that no longer recognized itself. In the ruins of a once proud military machine, fragments of a final report circulated among German high command. Dated May 7th, just a day before surrender, the document was brief but devastating in its honesty. American artillery, employing proximity detonation, has inflicted casualties exceeding all other weapon systems combined since December 1944. Countermeasures have proven ineffective. recommend immediate cessation of hostilities to preserve remaining forces. It was an extraordinary admission, not just of defeat, but of the cause. The fuse, not the tank or the plane or even the atomic threat, had become the symbol of Allied superiority. And it wasn't just about destruction. It was about what the fuse represented. Each shell that detonated at 30 feet was a whisper of everything Germany had underestimated: the resilience of democracy, the ingenuity of American science, the overwhelming force of industrial coordination. Germany had believed in discipline, in command, in hierarchy. America had believed in scale, in collaboration, in possibility. The difference was now carved into the landscape of Europe. After the surrender, Allied intelligence teams swept through former German research facilities, hoping to find answers. What they discovered was telling. German scientists had indeed made significant theoretical progress on proximity fuses. On paper, drawings, formulas, even prototype components existed. But nothing had been produced at scale. The factories weren't there. The clean rooms weren't there. The workforce had never been trained. They found crates filled with unexploded American VT shells, captured during the early days of the bulge. But the German engineers hadn't understood what they were looking at. One team had concluded the internal components were radar reflectors. Another had assumed the fuse was an anti-aircraft timer, nothing more. They hadn't believed such electronics could survive the forces of launch. They were wrong. Back in the United States, as victory celebrations began, the factories that had birthed the proximity fuse ran at reduced but steady pace. Engineers were already adapting its principles for future use. The cleanroom techniques pioneered for fuse assembly would become the basis for semiconductor manufacturing. The vacuum tubes, once marvels of miniaturization, would pave the way for transistors and microchips. The legacy of the fuse would not end in the forests of Europe. At Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where the fuse had first been perfected, teams met to discuss post-war implications. They understood what they had unleashed, and they understood something more, that they had changed not just how wars were fought, but how wars would be imagined. Meanwhile, the veterans who had witnessed the fuse in action, those who had survived because of it or buried their enemies beneath it, carried memories they couldn't quite explain. Many spoke of silence after the shelling, a silence deeper than before. Others remembered finding enemy trenches with no survivors, only bodies curled together, untouched by blast but pierced by 100 downward angles of steel. It wasn't glory, it wasn't triumph. It was certainty, cold, mathematical, and irreversible. The proximity fuse hadn't made war easier, it had made it clearer. It had shown that progress doesn't just march, it detonates, precisely, at 30 feet above the ground, and when it does, nothing is ever the same again. In the Pacific Theater, thousands of miles away from the shattered towns of Europe, the proximity fuse had already proven its worth against an entirely different enemy. The skies over Okinawa were thick with Japanese aircraft, many flown by pilots with no plan to return. The kamikaze threat loomed large, threatening to sink American vessels and stall the final assault on Japan. But the US Navy had a secret of its own, one forged in the same factories that had armed Axelson's artillery. The VT fuse. Anti-aircraft batteries bristled on the decks of every major warship. Shells packed with proximity fuses were loaded, aimed, and fired in bursts. The results were staggering. Planes that once dove through flak with grim resolve now exploded hundreds of feet away. The fuse didn't need a direct hit. It just needed to get close. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American naval gunners used proximity-fused shells to shoot down over 400 Japanese aircraft. The kill rate was unprecedented. A weapon designed to detonate at optimal distance turned waves of kamikaze assaults into smoke trails. Admiral Willis Lee, a career officer and pragmatist to the bone, summed it up bluntly. Proximity fuses saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific. He wasn't exaggerating. Before the fuse, it took over 1,100 rounds to down a single aircraft. After its introduction, the average dropped to just over 300. Japanese pilots spoke of sky explosions that seemed to chase them, bursts that felt sentient. Some veered off at the last moment, others pressed on, only to vanish in mid-air, torn apart before reaching their targets. The proximity fuse turned flak clouds into lethal nets, and still the workers back home toiled in anonymity. At a facility in Ipswich, Massachusetts, 9,000 women, many fresh out of high school, others mothers with husbands overseas, sat beneath fluorescent lights. They wore white coats and rubber gloves. Their hands, steady from repetition, placed vacuum tubes into casings no wider than a lipstick tube. They worked under microscopes, hours at a time, inspecting circuits for flaws invisible to the naked eye. They didn't see the battles their hands helped win, but their work was precise, unrelenting, and exact. Each shell that burst near a Zero or a Betty bomber carried their fingerprints, figuratively if not literally. Each detonation in the Pacific sky was powered by a fuse they had built. In time, the fuse became more than a tool. It became a doctrine. Military planners saw the future in its circuitry. If intelligence could be embedded into ammunition, why not into bombs? Into missiles? Into rockets? The age of smart weapons began not with a bang in the desert, but with a hum in a factory, a circuit charged by a slipstream, a detonation precisely 30 feet above the Earth. And while the Pacific victories piled up and the skies grew quieter, a new question began to form, not among soldiers, but among scientists and strategists. If war could be made this precise, this efficient, what came next? The proximity fuse had changed everything, but its greatest legacy was yet to come. It had opened the door to a future shaped not by mass, but by mastery. As the guns of World War II finally fell silent in May 1945, the United States stood victorious on 2 continents. But its triumph wasn't built solely on courage or strategy. Beneath every battlefield, success was a foundation poured by industry, science, and the willingness to fuse them into something greater than either alone. Among the tools that made that possible, the proximity fuse stood out, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. It was miniature, precise, lethal, and it had been built not by soldiers, but by thousands of invisible hands. In the months following the war, military historians began combing through data. They tallied aircraft kills, infantry losses, and the explosive efficiency of proximity-fused artillery. The statistics were overwhelming. In naval engagements, VT fuses accounted for over half of all downed enemy planes, despite making up only a quarter of the ammunition fired. On land, their effectiveness against entrenched forces had been 3 to 10 times greater than conventional shells. But the real impact was psychological. Allied troops, once wary of prolonged shell exchanges, now advanced with confidence. They knew that enemy foxholes wouldn't survive, that defensive lines could be broken not in hours, but in minutes, that the enemy couldn't hide from the sky. For German soldiers, the opposite was true. Interrogations revealed a recurring theme: helplessness. The old rules of survival no longer applied. Foxholes, once lifelines, had become death traps. Movement brought exposure, stillness brought precision fire. A captured German infantryman described it best. The shell knew we were there, it always knew. Surgeons on both sides documented new wound patterns, deep punctures from overhead angles, clustered injuries to shoulders, necks, and spines. The American advantage didn't end with the shell. It extended to the operating table. Penicillin, plasma, and evacuation logistics saved thousands who would have died months earlier. The fusion of technology wasn't just in killing, it was in healing too. Even as war ended, the production lines that had birthed the proximity fuse didn't shut down entirely. The techniques they pioneered, clean room assembly, microscopic tolerances, mass production of delicate electronics, became the bedrock of the American post-war boom. The transistor, the microchip, the modern computer, all bore the fingerprints of VT fuse innovation. At Johns Hopkins, the scientists who had once pored over oscillator frequencies now turned to peacetime research. But they never forgot what they had built, and they never stopped wondering where it would lead, because the proximity fuse had done something remarkable. It had turned an artillery shell into a system. It had put decision-making into ammunition, and once that line had been crossed, there was no going back. Commanders in Korea would later ask for airburst shells by default. Vietnam would see their descendants in action, and by the 21st century, missiles would identify targets with sensors that traced their lineage back to the fuse that first hummed in the Ardennes. But in 1945, none of that was known. Only this was. In 30 feet of space, measured by tiny radios, the future had arrived. And for every soldier who had lived because of it, or died beneath it, that distance would mark a turning point not just in battle, but in history. The war had ended, but the world it left behind had been changed forever. And the fuse had lit more than a battlefield. It had ignited a new age. In the years that followed the war, the proximity fuse became a case study, pored over in universities, war colleges, and corporate boardrooms. Not for its destruction, but for what it represented: the extraordinary potential of integration, of government, academia, and industry moving with shared purpose. The story began in urgency. British scientists had the theory, American engineers had the factories, Johns Hopkins had the brains, Crosley had the hands. None of them, alone, could have succeeded. But together, they did something unprecedented. In under 3 years, they took a fragile concept and turned it into 22 million combat-ready devices. They didn't just build a better weapon, they built a better system. At the heart of it all was a simple idea: precision kills more efficiently than power, and precision could now be mass-produced. The women who assembled the fuses didn't wear uniforms or carry rifles, but they contributed to victory as surely as anyone who stormed a beach. They worked in silence, under glass, piecing together electronics that would travel across oceans and land in forests they'd never see. Their work was anonymous, their contribution was not. The proximity fuse didn't win the war alone, but it shortened it. It saved lives, and it changed how war would be fought forever. Germany had misunderstood America. They saw its democracy as messy, its culture as indulgent, its industry as unfocused. But what they missed, what they fatally miscalculated, was that American chaos was not weakness. It was energy, it was capacity. It was potential, waiting to be focused. And when it came together in the form of the VT fuse, it created something totalitarian systems couldn't match. Innovation at scale, not because of fear, but because of freedom. When the war ended, German scientists studied captured VT fuses with awe. Some admitted they'd never seen vacuum tubes so small or circuit assemblies so durable. Others noted how every component seemed designed not just to work, but to be built by the thousands every day. It wasn't just a miracle of engineering, it was a triumph of manufacturing. The Soviets, receiving limited fuse samples through Lend-Lease, tried to copy them. It took them nearly 7 years. Even then, their quality was never as consistent. Why? Because the fuse wasn't just a thing. It was a process, a culture, a system that valued tolerance, cleanliness, collaboration, and relentless improvement. The proximity fuse taught the world a hard lesson. Technological superiority isn't just about having smart people. It's about connecting them to power, to purpose, and to production. By the 1950s, its legacy was visible everywhere. In satellites, in missiles, in the early computers of IBM. The principles developed in haste for war now powered a peacetime revolution. But even amid all this innovation, one fact remained most profound. The fuse had changed what it meant to fight. No longer could a soldier dig and wait. No longer could armies rely on walls of earth or stone. The air had become the battlefield, the sky the new angle of attack. And in that air, just 30 feet above the ground, hung the future, buzzing quietly, invisible until it struck. Not by accident, not by luck, but because someone had built it that way. And because an entire nation had believed it could. By the spring of 1945, every German soldier who faced the front lines had learned to fear one thing above all else: silence. Because silence meant artillery was coming. And if it was American artillery, it often meant proximity-fused shells, deadly, accurate, and relentless. The old instincts, the time-tested reflexes drilled into troops for generations, drop, dig, hide, had all failed. Foxholes, once the last refuge of a hunted man, had become tombs. Overhead cover helped little. Steel could be bent, wood could be shattered, earth could be turned inside out. In 30 feet of space, measured by electronics smaller than a child's toy, the idea of safety had been erased. And that was the true weapon, not just the physical fragmentation of bodies, but the mental fragmentation of certainty. For the first time in modern combat, the laws of warfare had shifted not because of a bigger gun or a faster tank, but because of a microcircuit, because of an idea turned into a process, turned into a weapon, turned into a reality. General Patton, famously skeptical of new gadgets and soft science, Ishan became a convert. His Third Army's own reports praised the fuse for increasing operational speed. "We can now move faster," one division commander wrote. "We do not have to wait for long bombardments. The shells hit and the enemy is gone." Infantrymen noticed it too. They described feeling safer, not because the danger was gone, but because they now had control. Fire missions were shorter, more precise. Battles that once stretched over days collapsed into hours. The fog of war lifted, if only briefly, under the light of scientific precision. And in that clarity came something new: belief. Not in the shell, but in the system that built it, in the country that made it, in the strangers thousands of miles away, engineers, machinists, women hunched over soldering irons, who had given them this tool, this shield. The proximity fuse didn't just kill the enemy, it saved Americans. It spared them from assaults that never materialized. It destroyed snipers who never fired. It cleared hills that no longer needed to be stormed. And in doing so, it gave the Allies not just an edge, but a foundation. A way forward. As Germany surrendered and the Pacific cooled, the fuse faded into the background of history, overshadowed by mushroom clouds and peace treaties. But for those who had been there, for the ones who heard its hum in the silence before the blasts, it remained unforgettable. It was the sound of war becoming something else. Not brute force, not raw numbers, but calculation, coordination, mastery, a prelude to the future. And in that future, the lessons of the fuse would echo again and again, in smart bombs, in drones, in guided systems that still trace their lineage back to those first circuits fired in Belgium. 30 feet, that was all it took to redraw the battlefield. And as the last shells were fired, and the last foxholes filled with spring rain instead of steel, those who had survived understood something permanent. The war was ending, but the world had already changed. Because now the sky could think. It is easy to reduce war to numbers, divisions moved, shells fired, cities captured. But beneath those metrics lies something deeper. Human lives, human choices, human costs. And no weapon, no matter how precise, is immune to that weight. The proximity fuse was a marvel of science. It was also a weapon of devastating efficiency. It didn't just win battles, it redefined them. Yet for every success it achieved, it left behind a question. What does it mean when killing becomes predictable? When warfare becomes a system of circuits and math? For the German soldier in his foxhole, the answer came too late. There was no countermeasure, no heroism that could stop a fragment falling from 30 feet above. The very earth betrayed him. The sky, once distant, had been turned into a tool of annihilation. But for the American soldier, the fuse was salvation. It meant fewer charges into entrenched positions, fewer names on casualty reports. It meant coming home. It meant survival. And for the workers, thousands of women who had never seen a battlefield, who had never heard a shell scream overhead, their labor echoed in every detonation. They built safety with soldering irons. They stitched together victory with wire and patience. They didn't aim the shells, but they gave them eyes. After the war, many of those workers went back to quiet lives. Their names never appeared in headlines. Their contributions were buried in archives, but they were the beating heart of a weapon that helped bring fascism to its knees. The proximity fuse taught us that freedom, when organized, when focused, is a force greater than any ideology. That precision, born of collaboration and belief, can defeat cruelty, born of control. And yet, the moral reckoning remains. This was not a clean weapon. It caused terror, it caused suffering. It didn't discriminate, it delivered certainty, deadly and unflinching. But it also delivered victory. And perhaps that's the paradox we must live with, that sometimes the most humane path through war is the one that ends it fastest, with the fewest lives lost, even if the means are ruthless. In the quiet after battle, as soldiers returned home, as factories dimmed their lights, the legacy of the proximity fuse lived on. Not in the devices themselves, but in what they proved possible. That democracies can build, that freedom can produce, that when ordinary people believe in something larger than themselves, they can shape the world. At 30 feet above ground, democracy spoke in fragments, not to destroy but to survive, to endure, to overcome. And that's the story that remains, the story of a fuse that changed war and reminded us what kind of world we must fight for. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your reflections in the comments below. We'd love to hear what this history means to you. Thank you for watching.